Hi, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar. We'll give folks a minute to get settled in and join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Good morning to folks as they're trickling in. We'll give people one more minute to get joined for the webinar today, and then we'll get started. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Peshik. I'm a Senior Communications Officer with the Colorado Health Foundation, and thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation about Pulse, our annual statewide poll. Before we dive into the content today, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We'll start with a walkthrough of our Spanish language interpretation features and more information about the Foundation's commitment to language justice. For that, I'm going to turn it over to B, one of our partners with Community Language Cooperative, to explain how the interpretation will work during today's webinar. B, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Katie. Good morning, everybody. My name is B. Torres. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I will be your interpreter with the Community Language Cooperative. And as always, I want to thank you all for your commitment to language justice. Language justice means that everyone should have the right to speak in the language of their heart. To accomplish that today, we'll be using Zoom's simultaneous interpretation function. In a moment, we will activate that and you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you'll see a more icon. You can click on either one of these, and then you should be able to select interpretation and select either English or Spanish as the language of your heart. Please remember to also choose to mute original audio so that you're only hearing your language being spoken. Should you have any technical issues with the interpretation, please don't hesitate to type in the chat to the full group so that we can address your issues and move on. I will go ahead and repeat this in Spanish and then we can get started. Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Vi Torres. Yo seré su intérprete de la CLC o la Community Language Cooperative y les agradezco su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje, lo cual significa que todos tenemos el derecho de hablar y escuchar en el idioma de nuestro corazón. En un momento se activará la función de interpretación y aparecerá un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Favor de hacer clic en ese icono y elija inglés o español como el idioma de su corazón. También asegúrese de hacer clic en Mute Original Audio para apagar el audio original y solo escuchar en español. Muchísimas gracias. Ya podemos comenzar. Thank you very much. We can go ahead and activate the interpretation now.
Thank you so much, B. And just a few additional reminders before we begin. Dave, if you don't mind loading up the slide for us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email after the briefing. Just on that next slide, we'll have a little more information for you. And you'll be able to receive the recording after today's webinar. It can also be accessed on the Pulse website at copulsepoll.org. Closed captioning is available via the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you experience any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to us so we can help troubleshoot. We also welcome your participation. Please use that chat function to share your thoughts and questions throughout the session, and we will leave some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Dave. For those who may not be familiar, the Colorado Health Foundation is a statewide philanthropic organization. We champion the health and well-being of every Coloradan by advocating for and investing in solutions that advance health equity and racial justice. Our work is grounded in the belief that health and well-being should be within reach for everyone. And Pulse is just one of the tools that we use to listen to and partner with communities across Colorado. Next slide, please, Dave. A bit more about Pulse. The Health Foundation launched the annual Pulse poll in 2020 to better understand the perspective of adults across Colorado on the issues that impact their health and well-being. Pulse is not a single issue poll. We ask about a wide range of topics, and we also invite Coloradans to share in their own words what matters most to them. Through the poll, we gain insights into how people are feeling and what they are concerned about. And we share those findings with policymakers, community leaders, the media, and anyone who's interested. The results also directly inform our work at the Foundation to advance health equity. In keeping with our commitment to transparency, all poll data is publicly available and will be posted on our website at copulsepoll.org. We also have an interactive dashboard that will launch in mid-August that allows you to slice and dice the data however you need. And in keeping with our commitment to racial justice, we intentionally oversample key communities, including Black Coloradans, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans in Colorado. This helps to ensure that their experiences, perspectives, and priorities are meaningfully represented in this data. Today's session is the first of 3 briefings that we'll host to walk through this year's polls findings. I will drop the link to register for the upcoming briefings in the chat. With that, I'm excited to turn things over to our research partners who help us lead this work each year. Please welcome Dave Metz and Lori Weigel, the bipartisan research team that conducts the Pulse poll on behalf of the Colorado Health Foundation. Dave, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Katie. Very excited to get to the point of finally sharing the data from this year's survey. It's always nice to sort of get to the point of being able to actually convey what Coloradans think to the broader public, and that process begins today. I'm going to start by summarizing a little bit about the methodology of our survey, and then we'll dive right into the results. So as Katie mentioned, this is the 6th annual survey that we have conducted for Pulse, starting back in 2020. As we go through the data, you'll see a number of comparisons to those prior years' survey data so that we can understand not just what Coloradans think today, but how public opinion in the state has been evolving over the course of the last few years. And it's obviously been an eventful few years. We started the survey in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and there's been a lot of political, economic, and social change that's taken place over the years since. The data we're sharing today comes from survey interviews that were conducted between mid-April and mid-May. We ended up interviewing 2,333 Coloradans, and as Katie noted, that includes oversamples of Black, American, Indian, and Alaska Native Coloradans and Asian American Coloradans. That allows us to speak with a great deal more confidence about the opinions of those subgroups than would be the case if we just conducted a general population survey. And because those are relatively small slices of the statewide population, we wouldn't have as many interviews to delve into. All of the data has been statistically weighted to reflect the true demographic and geographic composition of the state's population based on census data. I should also note that the interviews were conducted in English and Spanish. And the reason that you have 2 pollsters on the line today is that, as Katie alluded to, we form a bipartisan team. My firm, FM3 Research, when we poll in candidate races, only polls for Democrats. My colleague Lori, who you'll meet in a moment, at Newbridge Strategy, conversely only polls for Republicans in partisan races. But the 2 of us have been working together for over 2 decades as a bipartisan team to conduct research on broad issues like those that we explore in Pulse. Now, in order to make sure that we give all Coloradans as much opportunity as possible to participate in the survey, we have a wide range of different methods that we use to reach out to members of the public and invite their participation. We call people on both landline and wireless phones. We send invitations via email and text message, and even a handful of invitations via postcards as well for respondents for whom we don't have other contact information. And this allows us to reach the most random and representative sample of adult Coloradans that we can. All of those invitation methods drive people to one of 2 versions of the survey, either a telephone interview or an online interview. And then we bring all that data together to get a full picture of what residents of the state think. And this is the same methodology we have been using since the initial poll in 2020 to ensure that the responses or the methodology is consistent over time, and we can really have apples to apples comparisons between each year's responses. So with that introduction, let's talk a little bit about, one more methodological point. You're going to see a number of places in the data where we break out responses to questions by subregions within the state. There's 5 different regions that we look at. The Denver metro area, which is represented by the counties that you'll see in the middle of the map here, essentially Denver and its suburbs. We then have both the Eastern Plains and the Western Slope as broad regions. We also look at Larimer and Weld counties as a distinct subregion. And then for the Colorado Springs region, that includes both El Paso and Pueblo counties. So just to kick the survey off, we had one very broad question, which was intended just to help us understand how Coloradans feel about living in the state and what are some of the things that they like most about being Coloradans. This was an open-ended question. Respondents could answer with whatever words or phrases they wanted to, and then we grouped and categorized what they told us afterwards. So we asked people, other than the weather, which aspects of life in Colorado do you value most? And you'll see that overwhelmingly the responses are focusing on the natural setting, the state's beauty. We've got about 2/3 of respondents who mention some aspect of that as what appeals to them about living in Colorado, whether it's just how gorgeous the state looks or the opportunity to participate in outdoor recreation. About 1 in 5 Coloradans tell us that it is the feeling of community and neighborliness that they have within the state. And then you'll see a range of other items that smaller subgroups of Coloradans mentioned that have to do with the state's culture, its lifestyle, and its diversity as things that they find appealing about living here. And just to give you a sense of how people articulated some of these aspects of Colorado's appeal in their own words, you'll see some selected responses from individual survey respondents here. And you'll note that in some cases, people are mentioning more than one thing that they like about living in Colorado, because obviously for many people, there's a lot of things that appeal about the state. I think it's kind of refreshing to look at this data and sort of ground ourselves in it to begin the conversation, because as we're about to see, Coloradans also recognize a number of challenges and problems facing the state that they want to see addressed. But all of that goes hand in hand with the many things that they love about living in Colorado. So with that said, let's turn to some of the top concerns that Coloradans expressed in the poll. We had another open-ended question, one that we've asked in each year's survey, where we had respondents tell us what they saw as the most important issue facing Colorado right now. And this year we saw a significantly different response than we have seen in the past. Almost 1/3 of our respondents mentioned something having to do with government or politics as the biggest issue facing Colorado. Now, when we break that down, as you'll see in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, the majority of these comments were focused on objections to one party or the other's approach to politics and policy. About 19% of respondents offered criticism of the Trump administration or Republican leadership. About half as many, 9%, offered criticism of the Polis administration or Democratic leadership. And then the balance of the comments were people who were just concerned about political polarization or gridlock or other elements of the political system writ large, without attributing it to one party or the other. You'll see another set of concerns that are pretty high on the list here. We have the cost of living and inflation and housing affordability as the next two most frequently mentioned items. Those obviously have to do, both of them, with the cost of living. So that's almost 1/4 of respondents who are mentioning that. We've got another 4% who talk about the economy and jobs. So significant concern about the cost of living, and we'll see that reinforced in some of the later survey questions as well. But no other individual issue that even 1 in 10 Coloradans are pointing to as the biggest issue facing the state. Now, we should keep in mind this is just a question that's asking people to pick one, and it is certainly possible that Coloradans are concerned about many things at once. Later questions will shed light on that. But in terms of what's on the top of their mind, a lot of it has to do with politics. And again, here you'll see some examples of the things that people mentioned in their own words. Some of them are coming from the political right, some of them are coming from the political left. And then other people are expressing concern about basic kitchen table issues. So you'll see there in the middle of the slide, cost of living, taxes, cost of food, electricity, a range of issues that are pressing on Coloradans' minds right now. Now, as I noted, this marks a departure from what we have seen in past years. This slide shows the percentage of respondents that fell into each of these individual categories in past years' surveys. And that top category of government and politics, you'll see we've never even had 20% of respondents who named that as their top concern. And this is despite the fact that the Pulse survey started during the first Trump administration, the entirety of the Biden administration, and now the beginning of the second Trump administration. So there's been a lot of political change and tumult over that period of time. but this is the first time we've really seen it be such a central focus for Coloradans as the issue that most concerns them. There are a handful of issues where we have seen some declines over time that I think are sort of making room for these concerns about politics. Immigration, which spiked as a concern last year, declined this year in terms of the proportion mentioning it. The share who tell us they are concerned about wildfires was higher in the earlier part of this decade and has declined over the course of the last 2 years. But the big change really is that higher number focused on government and politics. Now, that doesn't mean, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there aren't other issues that concern Coloradans. We also had a follow-up question where we offered the respondents a list of issues facing the state and asked them to rate each one on a 4-point scale as either an extremely, very, somewhat, or not too serious problem. We've ranked them on this slide and the following based on the proportion who rated each either extremely or very serious, the top 2 points on that scale. And here's where you'll see that overwhelming concern about the cost of living is really still the dominant issue for Coloradans. Solid majorities label it not just a very serious problem, but an extremely serious problem, whether we're talking about the cost of living broadly or the cost of housing more specifically. Anticipating this result, we had a number of questions that took a deeper dive into cost of living concerns. Lori will be talking about those in just a few minutes. But you'll see a range of other issues that score highly on the list. We've got 3 others that roughly 2/3 or more rate as very serious problems: cost of healthcare, homelessness, and drug overdoses. 4 of those top 5 issues are relating to aspects of the cost of living or housing. And obviously, homelessness as an issue has some ties directly into the cost of housing as well. So it just speaks to the degree to which those issues really are central concerns for Coloradans. Also, solid majorities, as you'll see here, concerned with a range of other issues, including mental health, crime, and wildfires. As we move down the list, you'll see that there's a number of issues that rank as lower level concerns for Coloradans. Right now, we have fewer than 1/3 who express significant concern about police violence and misconduct, racial bias and discrimination, and then at the very bottom of the slide, crime in your neighborhood. There is a telling contrast that we see here between the proportion who are concerned about crime in their immediate community. It's only 24%. But then if we flip back to the previous slide and you look at the bottom, you'll see that when we ask about crime in general, 55% are concerned about it. What that tells us is that a lot of concerns about public safety may have more to do with what Coloradans are seeing, reading, and hearing about happening in the state more broadly, as opposed to what they are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. And we saw this same dynamic in last year's survey, which is the first time that we asked both of those questions to try to get at this issue. I'll note here that there's a couple of issues where we see some really stark divisions, where there are sizable numbers of Coloradans that view them as extremely serious problems, but also sizable numbers in those blue shaded bars on the right that dismiss them as not being a serious problem. Those include climate change, illegal immigration, and restrictions on reproductive rights. As we'll see in a few moments, the main reason for that is partisanship. Those are issues where members of one party view them as extremely critical concerns, and members of the other party largely dismiss them. Now, as we look at this range of issues, we haven't seen dramatic changes relative to last year's survey. Most of the numbers are within 5% or so of where they were last year. Our survey's margin of error overall is about 3%. So those changes are in most cases not statistically significant, and in some cases barely so. We do see increased concern about the cost of healthcare. The number in this year's survey is the highest we've seen at 75%. We'll talk more about that issue a little bit later on, but it seems entirely possible that the policy debate we've been having over the last few months at the federal level about funding for Medicaid in particular may be playing into some of those concerns as well. So given that there are all of these issues that Coloradans view as significant problems, a natural question to ask as a follow-up is, what do Coloradans feel like they can do about it? Do they see a role for themselves in taking action to try to make things in the state better? To explore that, we asked a new question in this year's poll that we hadn't tested previously, where we offered the respondents a list of ways that Coloradans can improve their community. Some of them involve participating in the policymaking process or political process. Others have more to do with the way people interact with others in their community. But we asked the respondents to rate how effective they thought each of these approaches was on a scale from 1 to 7. The blue bars on the right-hand side are the proportion that rated each a 6 or a 7, so sort of high degree of confidence that these are effective. The red bars are the 1 to 3s, so largely dismissing them as ineffective. And then the 4s and 5s are the yellow bars, which are kind of a lukewarm feeling of impact. So the thing that they are most confident in is volunteering with organizations working on social causes that you care about. The average score there was a 4.7. More than a third rated it as very effective. That's what Coloradans seem to think is going to make the most difference. But when we talk about things that involve advocacy within the political or policymaking process, the confidence is much, much lower. The midpoint on our scale is a 4, and on average, every other item that we tested scored below that midpoint of 4 in terms of how effective the respondents thought it would be. And you'll see that even when it comes to things like communicating directly with policymakers or speaking at public meetings, expressing support for political candidates, or just voicing one's support for social or political issues, whether it's on social media or in other venues, fewer than 1/4 of Coloradans tell us that they are confident that that will be a very effective strategy to bring about change. I will note that this data does not differ greatly from what we see in other parts of the country when we ask similar questions. We are in an era where there is a lot of cynicism and disillusionment with government and politics. We see that in some of the concerns Coloradans expressed earlier in the survey. And it means that people feel somewhat disempowered. They lack confidence that their engagement, their involvement is going to put things on a different path. Now, looking at the way the different subgroups of respondents reacted to this question, we see some interesting differences emerge. On these next few slides, we're looking at the percentages that rated each item a 6 or a 7. So they correspond with the blue bars on the slide we just saw. And we do see notably higher confidence from our African-American respondents in the degree to which they think that their engagement can make a difference when it comes to volunteering with organizations working on social causes you care about. That's the one racial or ethnic subgroup where we see an outright majority say, yes, in this sort of top-ranked activity, I'm very confident that it is going to bring about a positive difference. There are some partisan gaps in the confidence that that people have about this kind of civic engagement. Strikingly, on every single sort of path of action that we tested, Democrats express more confidence in their ability to bring about change than Republicans do. And the gap is very wide on that first item. Volunteering with organizations working on social causes you care about. Almost half of Democrats believe that will be highly effective. And only 24% of Republicans say the same. But for just about everything else on the list, while there are some partisan differences, they are differences in degree rather than sort of overall sentiment. There's not much confidence among any partisan subgroup about the impact that their engagement will have. Regional differences are also relatively modest. What stands out here is respondents on the Eastern Plains have less confidence in a variety of the methods of engagement that we tested than is true for residents in other parts of the state. Some of that may be a reflection of partisanship. Obviously, Eastern Plains is a more conservative area of the state, and the partisan differences we saw on the last slide may somewhat be reflected there. And then finally, when we divide the state not by sort of specific geographic areas, but by the type of community in which respondents live, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural, you do see a gradation here, where urban residents are more confident in the impact of volunteering with civic organizations than is the case for rural residents. But for most other items, we're seeing sort of a lukewarm belief in the effectiveness of a variety of kinds of civic engagement. So with that overview of some of the big picture findings, we'll take a deeper dive on some specific issues. And by far the biggest that we saw in the survey was the cost of living. And I'll hand it over to Lori now to talk through some of what we learned there.
Great, thank you. So, as Dave mentioned, the cost of living topped the very long list of all different issues that people could potentially think of as a problem in the state. This is one we have asked consistently over time. And as I probably talked about last year, we saw a big jump between 2021 and 2022. And really, we've hovered in much the same sort of intensity of people seeing this as an extremely or very serious problem since 2022. 89%, almost 9 in 10, tell us this is either an extremely serious problem or a very serious problem. And almost no one is dismissing the rising cost of living as a general concern in the state. There are some distinctions, though, among subgroups in terms of who tends to be more concerned. Younger women, for example, 93% are telling us that the rising cost of living is an extremely or very serious problem. I'll note there's almost no one that dismisses this as an extremely or very serious problem. So really, sometimes we're seeing some distinctions possibly without difference here, just a little greater intensity among a few subgroups. There is one distinction based on income. Those in the highest income category tend to be slightly lower, but again, 84% even of them are telling us that the rising cost of living is an extremely or very serious problem. And there is one geographic distinction on the next slide that is notable. Those on the Eastern Plains, somewhat less likely to say it's an extremely or very serious problem, but again, it's almost 3/4 of those residents telling us that this is, again, the rising cost of a living is really dramatically impacting them. Parents, caregivers of others other than children are also likely to tell us, the most likely to tell us it's an extremely or very serious problem. We've also asked the last several years about people's perceptions of their own financial status. So as you can see, not a great deal of change over the last year, from 2024 to 2025. More people sort of moving into a middle situation of either living comfortably but not increasing savings, or just getting by financially. But again, not a great deal of change over the last several years within this spectrum of self-categorization of their own financial status. Predictably, there is a huge relationship to household income, which was also self-reported. So it's stark to note that those in the lowest income categories, 84% tell us either they're just getting by or really struggling financially. And then that gradually sort of shifts until we get to the highest income categories, which is the only group where we have a plurality telling us they are living comfortably with increasing savings. All other Coloradans in lower income categories are telling us for the most part that they're living comfortably maybe, but not increasing savings or just getting by. So there's the strongest relationship really predictably is to income, but it's also worth noting on the next slide that there's some other groups that bears a strong relationship that I don't think anyone will be shocked by, whether someone owns a home or is renting, and their employment status has a great deal to do with their perceptions of their own financial status. So those who are unemployed right now, definitely more likely to be in those categories of just getting by or really struggling, as are renters more likely to categorize themselves in that type of a situation. So that's sort of where they're perceiving themselves to be. If they compare their financial situation to how they think they were a year ago, you can see that, again, sort of that 2021 to 2022 is where we saw a stark break in terms of people saying that they felt like they were doing worse than the previous year. And that's kind of stayed relatively stable over the last several years. Today, we have 2 in 5 almost telling us that they feel they are worse off financially than they were a year ago. Just 1 in 5 saying they were better. And then certainly a plurality there, 40%, telling us they're faring about the same. So really not a great deal of huge change over that over the last several years. It was really 2021 going into 2022 where we saw that big break. And again, not shockingly, that's also where we saw rising cost of living becoming a greater concern during that same time frame. Now we know that Coloradans, when we sit down and have conversations with them about how things are doing, and we'll often do focus groups and that type of qualitative exercise for a range of clients in the state, we know that one of the things that often comes up is just how that affordability can impact their perception of whether they can stay in Colorado in the future. In fact, today we have 70% telling us they're at least somewhat worried about whether they'll be able to afford to live in Colorado going into the future. More than 1 in 4 saying that they are very worried. That's something we've heard a lot about, and it's something that this data really captures dramatically, is that concern. And we know they love the state. We know they love lots of aspects of the state, as Dave talked about, but just whether they'll be able to afford to stay in the state is definitely a concern today. And it tends to be a concern based, again, on a number of different factors. Those along the Front Range and West Slope tend to be most acutely concerned, where we have majorities saying they're very or somewhat worried. Just slides under that halfway mark to 44%, saying that they're worried in the Eastern Plains. We also see that obviously income has something to do with it and bears a strong relationship, but even the highest income Coloradans that we spoke to are concerned about that, 60% saying they're at least somewhat worried about whether they'll be able to stay in Colorado in the future. We also know that there's some acute concerns that we've tracked over time, looking at specific worries. One that I think is going to be stark going into the future is how worried they are that they might not always be able to afford enough food to feed themselves and their family. Again, we saw a big peak in 2022 data where we had the highest proportion, 38%, saying that they were at least somewhat worried about being able to afford enough food to feed themselves and their family. That has gradually declined. It's at 29% today, but again, that's more than 1 in 4 Coloradans registering that concerned about simply being able to feed their family right now. And we also see some distinctions underneath that overall concern today of 29%, where you can see, for example, Hispanic or Latino Coloradans, 2 in 5 telling us they're worried about feeding their family. In fact, respondents of color more likely than white respondents to tell us that they're worried about that. And again, a huge relationship to income, where it's more than 2/3 of the lowest income Coloradans that we spoke to indicating that they are worried about not being able to afford enough food to feed themselves and their family, and about half even in that next income category. It certainly declines with income. We also saw that in terms of being concerned about affording enough food to feed themselves and their family, there are some distinctions here over time. We've seen some declines, as we talked about, that overall decline has happened. Even in the last year, we saw it dropping off by double digits among Asian Pacific Islander Coloradans and those American Indian Alaska Native Coloradans. Some other declines is really those Hispanic and Latino respondents that continue to be the ones that are really telling us that this is a major worry for themselves and their family. Another thing that we ask them if they've experienced is having work hours cut back or wages reduced. 1 in 5 Coloradans have told us that they are concerned about that. And again, we see that that is significantly higher among respondents of color, where it hovers around a quarter of those that are concerned about that. And again, it is very much in line with household income, where we have 1 in 3 of the lowest income respondents telling us they're concerned today about work hours being cut back or wages reduced right now. Then on the next slide, we also asked them in the last 12 months, have they experienced being laid off? And again, a huge relationship to income. So we've seen this hover around 1 in 10 Coloradans last several years. It's at 8% today. So not huge differences. But one thing that is held true is that definitely income of the household is something that bears a strong relationship. We've got 17% of the lowest income households. Everyone else is in the single digits, but again, certainly consequential if that's you and your family. And again, we saw that Hispanic Latinos are most likely to report right now having been laid off. And again, you know, some real distinctions there based on income, as we talked about. If we look at the next slide, we also asked them about skipping meals because they could not afford food. This is one that always sticks with me. So we've seen we saw some big spikes occasionally in 2022. Again, it went up dramatically, sort of hovered there. It came down slightly. We're at 12% today, indicating that in the last year, they have skipped meals because they could not afford food. That tends to be highest among our American Indian, Alaska Native Coloradans. They were at 22%, again, just slightly lower among Black and or Hispanic Coloradans as well. And then again, it's really high, 2 and 5 households in the lowest income category there, but significant proportions, again, really bears a strong relationship to income as we look at those experiencing that particular issue. So a lot there to be concerned about in terms of the rising cost of living. One aspect that we know bears that has been really acute is the concern about housing and cost of housing. I'll pass it to Dave to talk more about that.
All right, thank you, Lori. We knew from past year's research, and it was validated again this year, that the cost of housing seems to be the biggest driver among people's overall cost of living concerns. We saw the level of concern about this issue really creeping up during the first few years of Pulse during the pandemic. It went from 37%, labeling it an extremely serious problem, to 61% by mid-2022. And has stayed in that same neighborhood in each successive poll since. And today we've got almost 9 in 10 Coloradans who are telling us that they view the cost of housing as a very serious problem. This is not something that is just abstract for many Coloradans. In fact, worries about housing costs jeopardize their ability to hold on to their own home. When we ask people to look ahead over the next year and tell us how worried they are that they might either lose their home, have to downgrade it, or have to move because they can't afford either the rent or the mortgage, whether a homeowner or a renter, we have nearly 1/3 of Coloradans who tell us they are at least somewhat worried. That number has been pretty stable over the course of the last 4 years, and it includes about 1 in 10 Coloradans who are at more of a point of crisis, saying that they are very worried about losing their housing. So for many, this is not just something that worries them looking forward. It's something that today poses an immediate threat to their ability to live where they want to live. And it is also something that forces them to make a series of financial compromises that they might not otherwise want to make. We asked our respondents to tell us whether they had taken a variety of actions over the course of the previous year in order to be able to pay their rent or mortgage. And you'll see here we have a host of steps that about 1/4 of Coloradans have taken in order to try to address their housing costs, including cutting back on or going without needs like food or healthcare. We'll remember those numbers that Lori went through a moment ago about people who are concerned about those issues, and housing costs are sort of the hidden factor that may be forcing some of the food insecurity that the Coloradans are experiencing or anticipating. Working multiple jobs, or in the case of renters, avoiding asking their landlord to address issues that need to be fixed because they are worried about a rent increase or an eviction. And then we have slightly smaller numbers, about 1 in 5, who tell us they have taken on high interest debt, fallen behind on other bills, or stayed in housing that wasn't right for them because they couldn't afford to make a change. So there are all kinds of ways that the cost of housing has ripple effects in Coloradans' lives that forces them to take risks with their health, with their finances, with their quality of life in order to just make sure that they have a roof over their heads. Now, this is a question that we asked for the first time in last year's survey, and to the extent that there's any silver lining in these results, it's that some of the numbers we see this year are lower than what we saw last year in terms of the proportion of Coloradans who report having to make some of these financial adjustments in order to afford their housing. There have been more notable drops among the proportion who say they've been working multiple jobs or more hours than they want to, or avoiding asking their landlord for to address issues because they're worried about an eviction or a rent increase. So that suggests that some of these pressures may be easing slightly, but obviously this is something we're going to want to follow up on in future polls and hopefully see this shift we have seen this year turn into a somewhat more durable trend. So with that, I will hand it back to Lori to talk about our last section, which takes a deeper dive on issues relating to healthcare and healthcare costs.
So not surprisingly, given that the cost of everything is a big concern, it's really notable, though, that we've seen a jump just in the last year, as Dave mentioned before, in some of the earlier slides, in concern about the cost of healthcare specifically. So it's not as if anyone has not been concerned about the cost of healthcare over the entire time that we have asked about it. We basically had around 2/3 telling us each of the last years that this was an extremely or very serious problem. We've just bumped up that level of concern to 75%, telling us that it's an extremely or very serious problem, and the highest proportion yet, 44%, giving it that highest category of an extremely serious problem. So note that it's a mere and lonely little 6% that are telling us it's not too serious a problem. So it's really dismissed by almost no one. And in fact, that has a tangible outcome because people are telling us, in fact, that they're worried that they or someone in their household may be without health insurance coverage in the coming year. In fact, we've got 38% today telling us that they are very or somewhat worried about that. And that, again, is just a tick up from any level that we've seen before. Basically margin of error distinction from 2023 and 2022, but again, it's the highest number that we've seen to date that are telling us they are concerned about that. We did ask them why. Why are they concerned about they or someone in their household being without health insurance coverage? And while almost 1 in 5 talked about the potential for a layoff or loss of a job in the future, really, if we aggregate those next two categories, it is all about cost in many respects. So that increasing cost concerns, telling us that it's too expensive and they simply can't afford it. We've got a huge proportion that are worried, that are pointing to that cost aspect. But we also have sort of a lower tier of groups concerned about what they're hearing about Medicaid and potential cuts there, the political environment creating some uncertainty, and then specifically pointing to the administration right now in Washington and thinking about the implications that may have for their own personal insurance. So a host of concerns, and this just gives you a little bit of flavor of some of the verbatim comments that we recorded in terms of why people are telling us they're worried that they or someone else in their household will be without health insurance coverage in the future. So we also asked them to look back over the last year and tell us if they had postponed medical care. We know from past surveys a lot of that is related to cost concerns in terms of obtaining medical care. I think in a somewhat happier note, it's the lowest that we've seen. 30% are telling us that over the last year they postponed medical care. Not surprisingly, those who are unemployed, those who are without health insurance, and the lowest income respondents are the most likely to tell us that they have postponed medical care. over the last year. And what really stood out to me was those who are providing care to others are even telling us that they postpone medical care. Similarly, we asked about postponing dental care and saw a very similar response. 1 in 3 Coloradans telling us that they have postponed dental care over the last year. Again, lots of those same subgroups, whether they're the lowest income Coloradans, those who are not working right now, don't have insurance. Renters tend to be in this category as well as in the last one as well. But 1 in 3 Coloradans saying specifically that they postponed dental care. If we aggregate those two together, though, those who have postponed medical care, those who have postponed dental care, we have a combined 40% of Coloradans. So 2 in 5 Coloradans telling us that they have postponed some sort of care, medical or dental, in the last year. This graph is one that I have to always pull out my glasses to read specifically, but this is trying to aggregate lots of the experiences of Coloradans that we've just walked through the data on, of either postponing medical care, dental care. We asked about mental health care as well the last several years. That's about 1 in 5 Coloradans that say they postpone that. Those who've skipped meals, which again we noted before was 12%. So you can really see just such a significant proportion of respondents over time that are telling us that they have gone without in some respect or experienced something affecting their employment, either being laid off or having work hours cut back and wages reduced. So really significant proportions of the population in our state that are experiencing some of these disruptions and tangible effects from concerns about cost of living, concerns about cost of insurance, cost of healthcare, and all of these different aspects. I've been watching lots of questions pop up in the chat, so I'm going to pass it to Katie, who I think is going to help navigate some of those burning questions people have.
Thank you. Thank you again, Lori and Dave. I mean, this is just incredibly helpful and such a rich data set for us to go through today. A reminder to everyone that we will share the slides and the recording following the briefing, so you will have all that readily available. A few questions that we're going to go through. First, I wanted to just reemphasize something that Susan and Valerie had lifted up in the chat around different data broken down by different demographics. They were asking about data around food insecurity broken down by families with children. I just wanted to remind folks that we will have a real interactive dashboard that will be available on the Pulse website in mid-August, and that will allow you to go through and sort by different demographics, regions of the state, congressional districts. A whole variety of different demographics are available there. So definitely check that out when it's live in August. But again, if you have additional questions, always feel free to reach out. We're happy to help. Dave and Lori, one question that came through from Carolyn around our civic engagement data and the people feeling a low level of efficacy around different civic engagement activities. She had asked a question around, do you think that view reflects a need to work in solidarity with an organization as opposed to individually? Example, talking to legislators. Do you have any thoughts or additional data around kind of how people prefer to engage civically, and if it makes a difference if they're partnering with an organization versus on their own?
I guess I would say we actually completed a similar survey in another state recently where we asked a similar set of questions. There we had the opportunity to do some focus groups and have more direct conversations with residents of the state and sort of understand some of the thinking behind their feelings about civic engagement. Part of the reason that people don't engage more often is that they simply don't have enough time. They feel like their lives are busy, and it just, given that they see a relatively low return from engaging, that it's just not something they choose to do. I think working through an organization that eases some of the friction with getting engaged and makes it easy and less of a time commitment for them to do so could help with some of that. But regardless, I think we're still battling just a cynicism about the political process. People's feelings that the system is controlled by people with money, people with influence, people who are insiders, and that therefore they as outsiders, just their voices are not going to be factored in the same way that others with louder megaphones are. And that has less to do with partnering with another organization to get access and more with just their feeling a little defeated by the way politics works today. I think the answer to that is just continuing to find ways to reach out to them, to encourage them to show success stories where public participation makes a difference, shining a really bright light on that so people can see that example. I wish there was a sort of set of easier solutions that presented themselves, but I think that's a lot of what's going on.
That's great.
Katie,
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead,
I'll
Lori.
jump in because someone had a related question in the chat that just popped up. We did not name specific kinds of volunteer activities. Unfortunately, we can only ask so many things in any one battery of questions because we have so many burning questions about what Coloradans are thinking and experiencing at many different levels. So we don't know exactly what they would prefer to do or not do in terms of volunteering, but I think volunteering, as we've heard again in some of that other work, is just something that feels more approachable. It's not something where I'm having to go meet with some elected leader that maybe I don't know or just think of as a politician. It's just something that feels a little more approachable for them. But unfortunately, we don't know exactly what they would prefer to do within that spectrum of volunteering.
Great. Thank you for that, Lori. Another question earlier, you had highlighted some connections between mental health and the rising cost of living. Based on your observations, have you seen a noticeable uptick in mental health challenges as a result of that dynamic? Do you feel like cost of living, are you seeing any type of correlation between that mental health issues with the cost of living in Colorado?
I think we would urge everybody to join us in 1 month for phase 2 of the release of our data, where we will tackle that very specific question. The short answer is we learned a lot about those issues, and that's going to be one of the main focuses of our next data release in August.
Good cue up, Dave, for our next briefing. Can you talk a little bit about how do top concerns that you're seeing in Colorado compare to other states or other locations that you have both done polling in? Do you feel like they're unique, or are you seeing similar challenges in other parts of the country?
Well, I know we feel we're very unique, but the rising cost of living, cost of housing really is a sort of top tier concerns in many, many states. So even in states that we might look at and say, well, that's a more affordable place to live, we are still hearing concerns because everything's relative, and that run up in costs has been sort of happening in many different regions of the country. So we know those cost concerns are something that people are very much focused on. And if they have to pick one thing, it usually is the cost of housing that is the most acute concern. But we also see things like the cost of groceries being something that people think about. It's one of those purchases that you make on a frequent basis. So it's sort of the most in your face of having to pay for groceries every so often. But that's been something that respondents nationally have told us are sort of top tier concerns.
Thanks, Lori. Another question that just came through from John, saying he knows that we don't have a crystal ball, but knowing that there are already very deep concerns being expressed by Coloradans around rising costs, cost of healthcare, what impacts do you think some of the federal legislation that was recently passed, particularly that include cuts to Medicaid and food assistance, for example, what do you think these recently passed legislation, what impacts could those have on views in a year? And do you already see signs of those concerns showing up in polling?
Yeah, I mean, I think the policy changes that have been enacted or may be enacted in the coming months are definitely going to affect public opinion and the level of concern about those issues. You saw it in the data that Lori went through when we asked people if they're worried about losing their health insurance. One of the things a lot of them mentioned was an awareness that there are proposals at the federal level to cut back Medicaid in particular, and some fear cuts to Medicare as well. Just how much that shapes opinion is in the near term is hard to say. Obviously, a lot of those cuts were timed with a political calendar in mind and won't go into effect until after coming elections. And so the worst of it may not be felt fully for a couple of years. Other cuts, however, are going to go into effect much more rapidly. And even some parts of the state where we saw relatively less financial anxiety, particularly in rural areas like Eastern Colorado, the impacts on rural areas could be much more severe for some of those issues in terms of hospitals being impacted and access to healthcare. So I suspect we will see continued shifts in those questions and higher levels of concern. It's just unclear how quickly that may all play out.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And I think we have time for one final question before we wrap us up. Seeing some of the numbers around financial sacrifices tapering off a little bit or slightly declining, do you see that as a trend where people's individual financial situations might be improving, or do you think we just need to wait longer for that data to bear out?
It could be, I guess the hopeful answer to that would be that it may be a leading indicator. If you look at some of the data that Lori went through in terms of people's confidence about their own finances, it didn't shift dramatically in terms of people feeling like they were better off or worse off, or the degree to which they're struggling. There was a slight moderation in the proportion who felt that they were really struggling financially, but also a slight drop in the proportion who felt that they were living comfortably and increasing savings. If people felt less tangible impacts over the last year in terms of trying to afford housing or having to make some of these other sacrifices, that may indicate some easing of immediate strains, which may translate into broader financial confidence in future years. I think it's just too soon to tell. Obviously, I saw this morning there was a new inflation report that suggested that prices had gone up a bit relative to what people expected. We've got the tariffs and those kinds of impacts to counter with. So as the questioner said, we don't have a crystal ball, and it's hard to understand how all these threads may untangle themselves. But to the extent we saw declines this year, it's a hopeful sign. We just have to hope that those trends can continue despite the economic turmoil we continue to face.
Thank you so much, Dave and Lori. Dave, if you'll kick us to the next slide, I'll just kind of give us a few closing remarks. Just another tremendous thank you to Dave and Lori for their insights today. What we covered in this briefing is really just the tip of the iceberg. As we mentioned earlier, we will have 2 more upcoming briefings where we'll dive even deeper into the data. The next briefing will take place on August 13th. We'll explore where people's experiences across the state are aligned and where they diverge, and how Coloradans' perspectives differ based on geography and political identity and economic pressures. And then the third briefing will be on September 10th. It'll focus on the unique challenges and priorities of Hispanic and Latino Coloradans. That session will be presented in Spanish with live interpretation in English. On the next slide, Dave, if you'll go forward one more, you'll receive a follow-up email, as we said, with a recording and additional resources. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is listed there. Also, if you're part of a coalition or community group that would like a presentation or a conversation about the Pulse data, please contact me. We're happy to support those requests and can help tailor this content to your needs. So in closing, just another huge thank you to Dave, Lori, and the entire Pulse Poll team. We deeply appreciate your partnership in making this work possible. And thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.